The ones who called I lazy. Now pay rent to me. But it didn't start that way. I used to sit in the same corner of the same old house in Charlotte, North Carolina, tapping away at my laptop, while the people around me rolled their eyes and whispered about how I had wasted my education. My brother, Brandon, was the golden child. Harvard-educated, Wall Street financed, and family-approved. If you ever met my parents, Susan and Richard Collins, you'd hear Brandon's name within the first 3 minutes. He was their pride, their proof that the Collins family had raised them right. Me? I was the afterthought. I graduated with honors in computer science, followed it with an MBA in strategic innovation, and instead of signing with a Silicon Valley startup or going corporate like everyone expected, I made a decision that confused them all. I started freelancing. I stayed in Charlotte, moved into my late grandfather's old townhouse, and quietly worked on independent software development contracts from home. My mother would call it playing on the computer. Brandon called it a phase. And during family dinners, oh, those blessed evenings, my father would pour another glass of Cabernet and say something like, "Brandon just closed another deal with that hedge fund in New York. He might get promoted to senior partner next quarter." Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there, trying not to choke on my salad. Sometimes I'd get the classic line from Mom, delivered with a chuckle and a pitying smile. "You've got all that education, Avery. And for what? Sitting at home all day in pajamas?" They didn't know that my sitting at home was the reason our family business hadn't gone bankrupt. Our company, Collins Logistics, had been passed down from my grandfather. It specialized in warehousing and regional supply chain logistics across the Southeast. Nothing glamorous, but steady and reliable. Until it started falling behind. Dad used to handle it all, operations, accounting, even supplier contracts. But as the world moved digital, his systems didn't. Paper invoices, manual scheduling, outdated software from the early 2000s. No cloud backups, no automation. If there had been a cyber attack, we would have lost everything. And then came the stroke. It happened on a Sunday morning. He collapsed in the garden while checking the sprinkler system. I was the one who found him. Brandon? He sent flowers and said he was tied up with meetings. Melissa, his wife, the Instagram-perfect influencer, posted a filtered photo of a candle with the caption, "Sending prayers to our hero. #family first." She didn't visit once, so I stepped up. No big speeches, no grand declarations. I simply opened Dad's laptop, looked at the disaster of spreadsheets, and started cleaning it all up. By the end of the first month, I had digitized all the physical inventory data and built a cloud-based dashboard to track shipments in real time. 3 months in, I'd automated the invoicing system. 6 months later, I presented Dad with a detailed restructuring plan, one that included a silent investor network, scalability for regional growth, and software licensing opportunities. He couldn't speak well, but the way he looked at me, that was the first time I felt truly seen. We talked in low voices during his recovery, mostly late at night, and one evening, sitting by his bedside, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Avery, if this company survives, it'll be because of you." That was when we changed the ownership documents. He gave me controlling shares. Quietly, discreetly. He said he didn't want to fight with Mom or Brandon. He just wanted to know the company would be safe. And so, the paperwork was filed, legally, properly, silently. From that moment on, I wasn't just managing Collins Logistics. I owned the majority of it, but I didn't tell them. I didn't tell anyone. Let them believe what they wanted. Brandon kept bragging at Thanksgiving dinners. "We're thinking of expanding into global investments," he'd say, passing the gravy. "Dad's company might need some guidance, right?" Mom would beam and glance at me like I was the underachieving cousin from a different branch of the family. "Avery, you should ask your brother for tips, maybe shadow him for a week." I smiled, nodded, said nothing. They had no idea that while Brandon was trying to land luxury clients in New York, I had tripled the company's profit margins. No clue that I'd launched Collins Tech, our proprietary software arm, and certainly no idea that their lavish home was now under a management lease signed by my holding company. I still remember one evening vividly. Brandon was home for a short visit, standing in our kitchen in his tailored suit, tapping away on his phone. "So, what do you do all day again?" he asked me. "Still freelancing? Still watching YouTube videos about algorithms?" He chuckled and poured himself a bourbon. "Don't worry. If things get rough, I'll talk to Dad about bringing you on as an assistant or something. Social media rep, whatever it is tech people do." I just smiled and said, "That's thoughtful of you." That night, I opened my laptop and refreshed our Q4 dashboard. Revenue was up 64%. Net profit margin, highest in company history. I could have told him. I could have dropped the bombshell right then, but I didn't. Not yet, because sometimes silence is more powerful than victory. Sometimes it's better to let them build their house of cards. One smug comment, one dismissal at a time, until you're ready to blow. Then came the call. It was from Meredith, Dad's longtime assistant. Her voice was low, heavy. "Avery, I think you should come by the hospital. It's getting worse." I looked at the screen in front of me. The company's dashboard still glowing, my name clearly displayed as managing director. I whispered to myself, "They think I'm worthless. Let's see how worthless I look on the balance sheet." I shut the laptop, got in my car, drove to the hospital. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that exact moment, was the line between my silence and my rise. The morning of my father's funeral was gray in every way. Gray skies, gray suits, gray conversations. The Collins family gathered like clockwork at the chapel in downtown Charlotte, all pretending to be closer than we actually were. Brandon arrived fashionably late, of course, Melissa trailing behind him in a designer black dress, sunglasses perched high on her nose, like she was stepping out of a limo at a red carpet premiere instead of walking into her father-in-law's memorial. My mother, Susan, barely nodded at me as I took my seat near the front. Her grief was performative, dignified, composed, the kind of sorrow that looked polished for photos. I sat in silence, as always. But my mind wasn't quiet, because I knew that after the last flower was placed and the final sympathy card delivered, the true storm would begin. It didn't take long. 2 days after the service, Susan invited immediate family only to the house for a simple brunch. I showed up out of obligation. I should have known better. The spread was extravagant. Croissants from some overpriced bakery, salmon imported from who knows where, tiny bowls of fruit carved into floral shapes. Melissa had probably arranged it all for Instagram. Brandon clinked a spoon against his mimosa glass and stood up with that Wall Street confidence that made waiters rush to refill his drinks and people mistake arrogance for leadership. "Now that Dad's gone," he began, "we need to be serious about the future of Collins Logistics." I stiffened. "It's time we reestablish a structure, a leadership path. I'm ready to step in officially, and there's some deadweight we'll need to address." He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. My stomach burned. Susan dabbed her mouth with a napkin and nodded like she'd rehearsed it. "You've always been the responsible one, Brandon," Melissa chimed in, voice coated in sweet poison. "It's honestly uncomfortable, babe, having Avery still live in that old townhouse like she's 22 or something. I mean, no shade, but it's giving failure to launch." I blinked. The townhouse. The one I owned, technically through a silent holding company I'd created during the early days of the restructure. Brandon turned to me with mock concern. "We think it's time for you to move on, Ave. Maybe find something more suited to your skill set. Social media marketing, maybe. You've always liked being online, right?" It took everything in me not to explode. I looked at my mother. Her expression didn't waver. "This is what your father would have wanted," she said. No, it wasn't. That night, I watched the security footage from the house. Yes, I'd upgraded everything myself last year, and no one ever asked why. I clipped the entire conversation, saved it to a secure server, and labeled the file Collins Confrontation 001. Then I opened the encrypted folder on my laptop, Contingency Plan Alpha. Inside were the documents that would end all doubt. The equity transfer contracts my father had signed, the time-stamped ownership filings, the bank records showing investments funneled through my LLC, internal performance reports under my leadership, employment contracts for the logistics staff I'd hired in secret, A spreadsheet labeled Collins, Logistics Ownership, Confirmed Equity 62%, Avery Collins. They had no idea. They thought I was still their little sister, still the pajama-wearing tech girl, still dependent, still invisible. They didn't realize I had already become their landlord, their CEO, the force behind every penny they were still benefiting from. But this wasn't just about power. It never had been. This was about respect. And I was done being disrespected. 2 days later, I got a formal email from Paul Whitaker, Esquire. Dear Ms. Collins, as per preliminary discussions with Mr. Brandon Collins regarding the management of Collins Logistics LLC, we are preparing a transitional proposal. The document outlines leadership succession, updated board structure, and a review of asset reassignment. Your presence at next Thursday's meeting is expected. Expected, I scrolled down. Attached, a draft proposal suggesting I vacate my residence within 30 days and transition into a consulting role as needed. Paul Whitaker. Of course. I remembered the name. He had once applied for a mid-level operations job at my software startup 2 years ago, rejected after 2 rounds. And now, here he was, pretending to have authority over me. I printed the email and pinned it to my corkboard under the label, Delusion Files. Thursday arrived. I showed up to the Collins Logistics HQ, still bearing the family name, though it hadn't been theirs in over a year. They had no idea the building itself was no longer part of their legacy. I had purchased it quietly 6 months ago through another shell company, Ridgeview Capital Holdings, 100% owned by me. The elevator ride to the penthouse was quiet, polished mirrors, the scent of overused cologne. My heels clicked against the marble tile as I entered the conference room. Brandon stood at the head of the table, flanked by Paul and Melissa. Susan was seated near the window, pretending to read through a leather folder. "Glad you could make it," Brandon said with that empty, shark-like smile. "We'll make this quick." I took a seat, said nothing. Paul slid a thick packet across the table. "Here's the proposed succession outline. It makes legal sense and, frankly, it honors your father's unspoken wishes." I opened the folder, glanced at the garbage printed inside, and closed it. "Anything else?" I asked. Melissa huffed. "You could show a little gratitude. They're offering you a nice way out." I leaned forward. "This building," I said slowly, "was sold 6 months ago. Did you know that?" They looked confused. "New owner? Ridgeview Capital Holdings?" I smiled. "I own it." Silence. Paul laughed. "You're bluffing." I pulled out my phone, opened a secure document viewer, showed them the deed. Then I stood. "We'll have a formal meeting next week. Shareholders only. I'll bring the actual paperwork. And since you're already here, no need to book a venue." Brandon stood, voice rising. "You don't have the authority to call a shareholder meeting." I turned at the door. "I have 62% of the authority. See you next Thursday." That night, I sat on my balcony, sipping black coffee, laptop open in front of me. In the reflection of the glass, I didn't see the quiet one. I didn't see the disappointment. I saw someone ready. They thought they were preparing to remove me. They had no idea I was already preparing to bury them. Corporately, of course. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity, and it was long overdue. The conference room at Collins Logistics had never been so full. Brandon made sure of that. He invited everyone, shareholders, former board members, key clients, even a couple of journalists he claimed were just friends from business school. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a stage, and he thought he was the star. I arrived 10 minutes early. I always do. Melissa was already there, adjusting the lighting. Paul Whitaker stood by the projection screen, flipping through what I assumed was Brandon's leadership proposal. It was printed on heavy paper, of course, because branding matters more than substance in Brandon's world. The room buzzed with low conversations and clinking coffee cups. I stood quietly in the corner, watching them pretend the meeting was already decided. Brandon shook hands, gave out smug half-smiles, laughed too loud at his own jokes. "She'll probably show up in a hoodie," I heard him whisper to Paul, "and bounce when she realizes we're serious." He wasn't wrong about the hoodie. I was wearing one, but I wasn't going anywhere. 10 minutes past the hour, Brandon took center stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Today marks a turning point for Collins Logistics. With my father's passing, it's time we restore leadership stability and a forward-thinking vision. He glanced at me, then back to the room. As you know, I've spent the past decade managing multi-million-dollar portfolios on Wall Street. That experience gives me a unique edge to take Collins Logistics to the next level. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. A title appeared, Collins 2.0, The Future Starts Now. I stifled a laugh. He launched into a pitch filled with hollow buzzwords: synergy, scalability, vertical integration. A shallow man drowning in deep vocabulary. The room nodded politely. Then came the kicker. I've consulted with legal counsel and outlined a transitional leadership structure. My sister Avery will step down from her current informal advisory role. Informal? I said aloud, breaking my silence for the first time. The room shifted. Eyes turned to me. Brandon blinked. We agreed to let you speak after, Avery, he said, lips tight. And I agreed to wait, I said, walking forward, until I couldn't anymore. I plugged my laptop into the HDMI cable. The screen blinked. Brandon stepped aside, confused. What are you doing? Sharing facts, I replied. The screen came to life with a simple slide. Collins Logistics, current ownership and leadership structure. Underneath that header, 3 words in bold font: CEO, Avery Collins, majority. Stakeholder, 62%. Ownership, controlling authority, confirmed. There was a long, collective intake of breath. I clicked to the next slide, showing signed documentation, timestamps, and scanned contracts, all legal, all binding. Brandon's face drained of color. Susan muttered, "This must be a mistake." Paul took a step forward. "This wasn't presented to the board." "That's because the board was never reassembled after my father's health decline," I said. Per the amended agreement filed and signed in 2021, control reverts to the majority stakeholder, me, until such time a board is reestablished, which I'll be doing today. Melissa tugged Brandon's sleeve. "Babe, are we seriously screwed?" Brandon snapped. "You don't get to do this. You've never worked a real job a day in your life. You sat at home and played around on your laptop while Dad built this company." "Actually," I said calmly, "I rebuilt this company while you were out sipping bourbon and pitching hedge funds that tanked." I clicked to the next slide, showing performance graphs from the last 3 years. Revenue, up 312%. Net profit, doubled. Overhead, reduced by 43%. Employee retention, all-time high. New contracts, tripled. The numbers didn't lie. Neither did the investors in the room, who started whispering to each other. Then I played the security recording, the one from the townhouse meeting, the one where Brandon and Susan casually discussed pushing me out, calling me dead weight, with Melissa giggling in the background. The room went silent, and then, just as quickly, divided. Paul stepped up again, his voice defensive. "This feels highly orchestrated and manipulative." I turned to him. "Paul Whitaker, you applied to my tech firm in 2020. You didn't pass the second round. That rejection still bothering you?" He froze. "Your license was issued under your previous firm, Blackwell & Associates, which was flagged for conflict of interest 3 years ago. Should I keep going?" Paul stepped back. Brandon lunged toward my laptop. 2 security guards, my security, stepped forward and intercepted him. "You set this up," Brandon hissed. "You schemed your way into this." "I built my way here," I corrected, "while you posed for LinkedIn headshots." Susan stood up slowly, gripping the table. "Avery," she said in a trembling voice, "we're still family. We can work this out." I looked her straight in the eyes. "You've spent 10 years reminding me I didn't belong. This morning you texted Melissa a laughing emoji about me living rent-free. You don't want peace, you want power back, and I'm not handing it over." I turned back to the room. I called this meeting to reestablish leadership and protect our employees, our clients, and our name. Effective immediately, Brandon Collins and Paul Whitaker are removed from any advisory capacity. Melissa is banned from the building, per the updated harassment clause in our Code of Conduct. Melissa gasped. Brandon exploded. This company was supposed to be mine. It was never yours, I said. It was ours, but you didn't want to share, so now it's mine alone. The meeting concluded with silence. Only a few people clapped, the rest just stared. I didn't care, because I wasn't here for applause. I was here for the truth, and for the first time in years, it was finally on my side. Back at my office that night, I sat alone. No champagne, no celebration. Just a warm cup of tea and a quiet mind. There was no joy in humiliating them, just relief. A weight lifted. I opened my inbox. An email had arrived from Rachel Perez, the VP of one of our newest partners. Brilliant execution today. The room saw what leadership actually looks like. You have our full backing moving forward. I replied simply, "Thank you. This was only the beginning." I stood, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. Brandon had tried to play chess, but I was the queen, and I had just moved across the board with check. You'd think the room-shaking reveal in that conference room would have been the end of it. You'd think Brandon would have accepted the facts, packed up his overpriced leather briefcase, and disappeared into some overpriced New York office suite to lick his wounds. But that's not how people like Brandon operate. People like him don't go quietly. They retaliate, not with fists, but with whispers, poison-tipped words, and just enough manipulation to make you look like the villain. It started 2 days later. An anonymous email hit the inboxes of several Collins Logistics clients and minor shareholders. Subject line, urgent, concerns about Avery Collins's leadership. The message was a mess of half-truths and pure lies. Claims that I had coerced my father into signing over company shares while he was mentally unwell, that I had no real-world business experience, that I was emotionally unstable and had driven employees away with erratic behavior. I knew exactly who wrote it, but Brandon wasn't working alone. I tracked the metadata. It was routed through a burner account linked to Paul Whitaker's old firm. Sloppy, predictable, and laughable, if it hadn't been so dangerous. Because perception in business isn't about truth, it's about narrative. Then came the podcast. Some clickbait finance bro invited Brandon on to speak about family betrayal in legacy businesses. Brandon painted himself as a misunderstood heir robbed by a vindictive sister who hacked her way into ownership. He spoke with false humility, like he was heartbroken, not humiliated. Melissa, meanwhile, took to TikTok. She didn't name me directly, but her cryptic videos said enough. Just a reminder, not everyone who smiles at you is sane. Trust your gut. Stay safe. Family drama. She did it in slow motion, with sad piano music and a backdrop of her sipping tea on their patio. Cue the sympathy comments rolling in. Girl, I feel you. My style's the same. People who work from home think they're CEOs now. Cute. I kept silent. For a week. I didn't post, didn't clap back, didn't even mention it in meetings. But behind the scenes, I was working. And I wasn't working alone. Enter Derek Nguyen. Derek had interned for me during grad school. Quiet, brilliant, loyal to the bone. He'd gone on to become a cybersecurity consultant for several Fortune 500 companies. When I reached out, he didn't even hesitate. "Still want that revenge internship you joked about?" I asked. "You had me at revenge," he replied. Within 48 hours, Derek traced the email smear campaign directly to Paul's encrypted cloud account. We documented everything: IP logs, timestamps, edits, ironclad. He also pulled metadata from Melissa's videos. Guess where they were recorded? On Collins Logistics property, specifically inside one of the restricted warehouses. That was a violation of multiple conduct policies, especially since she wasn't an employee. Derek even dug up a forgotten recording, a Zoom call from 3 months prior, where Brandon had joked with Paul about flipping the board before the girl gets too comfortable. His words, on tape. It was time to respond. I called a new shareholders meeting. This time, we didn't meet at the old headquarters. We met at the newest jewel in the company's crown, a state-of-the-art logistics hub in Raleigh, North Carolina, designed, funded, and launched under my leadership. It wasn't just a building, it was a message. The ballroom was pristine. LED screens on every wall, live data feeds showcasing warehouse performance, client growth, employee satisfaction indexes. It looked like a Wall Street war room, because that's what it was. Brandon walked in with that smugness he always wore like cologne. Melissa followed, already filming something on her phone. Paul was noticeably absent. I took the mic. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to show you what leadership looks like. The screens lit up with growth metrics. 400% company value increase in 3 years. New client acquisition up 300%. Profit margins stabilized at 27%. Employee satisfaction scores, highest in company history. Then came the internal footage. Clip 1, Brandon mocking warehouse staff for being replaceable. Clip 2, Paul outlining how to fabricate investor concerns. Clip 3, Melissa recording cryptic mental health content from restricted office areas. The room was silent. Then I dropped the final card. All of this, I said, violates our updated ethics policy. Brandon Collins and Melissa Tate are now officially banned from all Collins Logistics properties, partnerships, and leadership discussions. Paul Whitaker has been reported to the state bar for breach of legal conduct and professional malpractice. Brandon stood, red in the face. "You think you're untouchable?" he shouted. "This company was built by our father." "No," I said, stepping forward. "It was nearly destroyed by his son and saved by his daughter." The shareholders voted. Unanimously, my leadership was affirmed. Brandon stormed out. Melissa trailed after him, still filming. I turned to the remaining board. "Let's get back to work." Later that night, Derek and I sat on the rooftop patio, sipping cold brew from the break room fridge. "You think he'll try anything else?" he asked. "No," I said. "He tried everything, and he lost." I opened my phone. An unread message from my mother. "Avery, this isn't what your father would have wanted. Brandon is lost. And you're not the person I raised." I stared at it for a second, then replied, "You're right, I'm not." I became better. I knew this wouldn't be the end of their resentment. But it was the end of their reach, and from that day forward, I stopped explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about evolution. And I had no interest in dragging the past with me into the future. Months passed. You'd think the chaos would have slowed down after the vote, after the public collapse of Brandon's attempt to take over. But sometimes the real silence comes only after the storm, and what it leaves behind is a strange combination of broken pieces and unexpected clarity. For the first few weeks, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Maybe another anonymous email, another video from Melissa's over-filtered iPhone, or a final legal threat from Paul Whitaker's LinkedIn clone of a law office. But nothing came, because they had run out of ammo. The company, meanwhile, didn't just recover, it flourished. We opened 2 new satellite offices in Georgia and South Carolina. Collins Tech, our logistics software division, had officially outpaced the warehousing side in both revenue and profitability. Investors who once sent cautious emails now wrote excited ones, asking about expansion, IPO plans, and interviews. I was invited to speak at 2 tech conferences and got featured in a Forbes Women in Business article titled "The Quiet Revolution of Avery Collins." Funny, isn't it? Quiet. It always comes back to that word. The quiet daughter, the quiet one, the one they didn't see coming. Brandon, on the other hand, did what Brandon does. He spun failure into fiction. His position at the New York hedge fund was terminated 3 weeks after our shareholder meeting. Word had gotten out, not just about his failed coup, but the ethics violations tied to Paul and the internal recordings. No firm wanted that liability. Melissa filed for divorce a month later. According to a mutual friend, she sold her side of the story to a podcast producer in LA. I never listened to it, but someone sent me the title, My Narcissist Sister-in-Law, a real-life corporate horror story. Creative, I'll give her that. My mother moved to Florida to live with her sister. Pride kept her from accepting the generous relocation package I offered. Instead, she started telling distant relatives that she always believed Avery would come into her own eventually. She even printed a copy of my Forbes feature and framed it in her guest room. I didn't respond to her emails, not out of hate, but because they were always laced with subtle guilt. Your father would be so disappointed with the division between you and Brandon. We used to be such a close-knit family." No, we weren't. We were a family bound by pretense, by hierarchy. A family that had room only for one golden child, and I was never it. Until I made my own crown. One afternoon, almost a year after the shareholder meeting, I got an unexpected visit. It was Mr. Carver, my father's old friend and former board member. He was retired now, but he used to be the one Dad called when things got too big, too messy. I invited him in. We sat in my office, surrounded by blueprints and screens and silent ambition that had finally found its voice. He looked around slowly, eyes wide. "He always said you had a spark," he said. "Said you thought like an architect, but moved like an engineer. That you didn't rush, you built." I swallowed hard. He never told them, did he? About the transfer? About the plan? Carver shook his head. "He wanted you to do it on your own. He said if they knew too early, they'd destroy it. But if you built it in silence, they'd have no choice but to respect it when the time came." I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt fully grounded in who I was and what I had done. And I realized something profound. This journey had never been about revenge. It was about recognition. Not from them, from me. Success didn't come with a parade. It came in small, satisfying moments, like when one of our junior engineers, fresh out of college, told me she'd never imagined a woman could run a logistics empire until she saw me speak at a local tech panel, or when Derek, now promoted to director of cybersecurity, told me, "You changed what this company is and who it's for." We had started a mentorship program for young women in tech, launched a partnership with a local coding boot camp, and even rolled out paid family leave for warehouse workers, something Brandon once called a luxury we don't have time for. I made time, because they wouldn't have, and someone had to break the cycle. Every now and then, I'd get a message from someone in Brandon's old circle. "Hey, Brandon's asking if you'd consider meeting. Just a coffee, no pressure." I never replied. Forgiveness doesn't always require reconnection. I wasn't angry anymore, just uninterested. Letting go wasn't about vengeance. It was about peace, and I had earned mine. One evening, I stood on the top floor of our new headquarters. The sun was setting over Charlotte, casting gold and fire across the skyline. The buildings below weren't just structures. They were proof that I was never the failure, never the joke, never the backup plan. They called me worthless. Now they live in properties I own, read headlines I'm featured in, and walk on floors I paid to lay. But the greatest satisfaction, it isn't in knowing they were wrong. It's in knowing I was always right about myself. I turned to leave the office. Lights dimmed behind me. Security logs blinked green. Somewhere downstairs, a shipment was being logged, a process running on software I wrote, a team working under policies I drafted. And outside, the city pulsed with motion, growth, legacy, mine. Final voiceover if this were a video script. They thought I was just the girl who sat at home on her computer, but what I built from that laptop became a foundation stronger than bloodlines or approval. In the end, this isn't just a story about proving them wrong. It's about proving myself right. And that is the legacy they never deserved, but I claimed anyway.